Sergeant Marcus Hale's spacecraft shuddered as it entered the atmosphere of the forgotten planet. He gripped the control panel tightly, sweat running down his forehead. His mission had taken a turn for the worse. What was supposed to be a routine peacekeeping survey had quickly become a desperate search for shelter after his ship was struck by a massive storm. Now, with his spacecraft badly damaged and systems failing, he had no choice but to make an emergency landing on a planet he had never planned to visit. The planet below was desolate. The surface was cracked and broken, with jagged mountains scattered across a barren, dusty landscape. There was no sign of life, nothing but silence and the dull gray of the planet's surface stretching out as far as the eye could see. As Marcus guided the ship toward the ground, his thoughts raced. He had no idea what kind of planet this was, or whether it was even safe to step foot on it. But it was his only option. The ship hit the ground hard, sending a jolt through Marcus's body. He quickly unbuckled himself, his mind focused on getting out of the wreckage before it completely shut down. His hands moved quickly, checking the controls for any signs of life in the ship's remaining systems. The screen flickered, showing a map of the planet's surface. There was a faint signal coming from a location nearby. It was weak, but it was there. Marcus wasted no time. Grabbing his emergency pack and weapon, he rushed to the exit hatch. The storm had cleared, leaving behind a thick, dusty air that clung to his skin. He stepped out of the ship and looked around. The landscape stretched out in every direction, nothing but endless rocks and dirt. Yet something felt off. It wasn't just the quiet. It was as if the planet had been abandoned, left to rot by its inhabitants. His boots crunched against the dry earth as he made his way toward the source of the signal. He had learned to trust his instincts over the years, and they told him that he wasn't alone here. Someone, or something, was waiting for him. He had to find out who, and if they needed help. After walking for what felt like hours, Marcus finally spotted something in the distance, a figure lying motionless in the dirt. His heart skipped a beat. The figure appeared to be an alien, with silver-blue skin that shimmered under the faint light of the twin moons overhead. The alien was badly wounded, her body covered in blood and dirt. Her breathing was shallow, and she appeared to be unconscious. Marcus knelt beside her, his training kicking in. He checked for a pulse, relieved to find it still faint but steady. She was alive, but barely. Her eyes were closed, and her face was twisted in pain. He could see the blood oozing from a wound on her side, the result of some kind of weapon strike. Whoever had done this had clearly left her for dead. His mind raced. Who was she? What had happened to her? He knew the galaxy was filled with conflict, but it was rare to come across an alien in such a state, especially one who seemed so far from home. He reached into his emergency pack, pulling out a medical kit and basic supplies. As he worked to clean the wound, he couldn't help but wonder why she had been abandoned here. Had she been a soldier, or was she simply a victim caught in the crossfire of a war? For a moment, he considered leaving her. His mission was to gather information, not to rescue anyone. But something about the scene tugged at his conscience. He couldn't just leave her there to die. Not after seeing how fragile she was, how alone she seemed. He decided then and there that he would do whatever it took to help her. The planet was inhospitable, and it would be dangerous to stay here long. But Marcus wasn't about to leave her behind. As he finished treating her wound as best as he could, he gently lifted her in his arms, careful not to jostle her too much. She was light, almost weightless, but her body felt fragile, as though it could break at any moment. Despite her obvious pain, she didn't stir. Her eyes remained closed, and her breathing remained shallow. Marcus carefully began his journey back to his ship, determined to get her to safety. The wind picked up again, but this time it didn't feel as harsh. It was as though the planet itself was holding its breath, waiting to see what he would do. As he moved forward, he couldn't shake the feeling that this was only the beginning of something much larger than he had anticipated. The alien girl, lying so still in his arms, had lost all hope, but Marcus was determined to change that. He didn't know it yet, but the moment he had decided to save her, he had set in motion a chain of events that would alter both their lives forever. He would not abandon her. Not now, and not ever. The journey back to the wrecked spacecraft was slow and steady. The wind had started to pick up, sweeping across the barren landscape in gusts that kicked up the dust into the air. The quiet was almost oppressive, the silence so complete that it felt like the planet itself had forgotten how to speak. But Marcus wasn't concerned with the planet's stillness. He was focused on the alien girl he had rescued. Her condition was serious, and every step he took felt like an eternity. He could feel her body growing heavier in his arms, but there was no time to stop. His training had taught him that when someone's life was in your hands, you didn't hesitate. Her name, as it turned out, was Iria. Marcus had discovered it when she briefly woke up, her voice barely a whisper, her eyes fluttering open just long enough for her to speak the name. She had then passed out again, slipping back into unconsciousness. The brief moment of connection, however fleeting, left Marcus with an unsettling feeling. He didn't know what it was, but something about her had triggered a deep sense of protectiveness in him. Perhaps it was because she was so fragile, so vulnerable. As he neared the wreckage of the ship, Marcus felt a sense of relief. The shelter of the spacecraft was close, and he could finally get her somewhere safe. But just as he was about to step inside, a sound cut through the air, distant but unmistakable. A low, rumbling noise that seemed to shake the very ground beneath him. Marcus froze, his instincts kicking in. His hand went instinctively to the weapon at his side, and he scanned the horizon, trying to determine the source of the sound. The last thing he needed right now was more trouble, but he had a feeling this was far from over. The noise grew louder, and it was quickly followed by the unmistakable sound of engines. Something was flying toward him. His heart raced. He didn't have the time or the resources to deal with another threat. He had to get Iria to safety. Marcus quickly made a decision. There was a small shelter nearby, a cave-like formation in the rocks that he had noticed earlier. He had no idea if it would offer any protection, but it was their best bet. He adjusted Iria in his arms, moving quickly but cautiously toward the shelter. The sounds of the engines grew louder, closer now, and Marcus knew they didn't have much time. As he moved, he kept his eyes trained on the sky, searching for any sign of the approaching threat. He couldn't allow anyone to find them. Not now. Not when they were so close to safety. The shelter was just ahead, and as he reached the entrance, Marcus ducked inside, laying Iria down gently on the ground. He took a moment to catch his breath, his heart still pounding in his chest. The shelter wasn't much, but it would provide them with a little cover, at least for a while. He quickly checked on Iria, adjusting her position to make sure she was comfortable. Her face was pale, and her breathing was shallow, but she was alive. That was all that mattered. For now, they were safe. But for how long? Marcus listened carefully, the sound of the engines now so close that he could almost feel the vibrations in the ground beneath him. The aircraft wasn't far away. Whoever it was, they were closing in fast. He made a quick decision. There was no way he could fight off an entire group if they came looking for him, not with Iria in this condition. His only option was to wait and stay hidden. The sound of the engines stopped just outside the shelter. Marcus held his breath, his hand still on his weapon. He couldn't see them, but he could feel the presence of whoever was out there. The silence that followed was almost unbearable. Seconds stretched into minutes, and still the quiet remained. Marcus's mind raced as he tried to think of what to do next. He couldn't just sit here forever. If they found them, they'd be in serious trouble. But then, to his surprise, a voice broke through the silence. "Who's there?" The voice was gruff, but not threatening. It carried with it an authority that suggested whoever spoke was in charge. Marcus hesitated, unsure whether or not to answer. He had no idea if this was a friend or foe, but he couldn't risk giving away their position by staying silent. "Marcus Hale," he called out cautiously, stepping forward, his hands visible and empty. Human soldier. I'm not looking for trouble. There was a long pause before the voice responded. You're far from home, soldier. What brings you to this cursed planet? Marcus held his ground. I was just doing a survey mission when my ship went down. I found someone. Someone who needs help. He gestured back toward Aria, though he knew they couldn't see her from the entrance. There was a brief silence before the voice replied again. Help, huh? Well, it's not often we find humans stranded out here. You'd best stay where you are for now. We'll talk. The sound of footsteps followed, fading as they moved away. Marcus stood still for a few moments, unsure what to make of the encounter. The voice had been calm, almost too calm, but at least they hadn't turned hostile. He glanced down at Aria, her face still pale but peaceful. He would protect her. No matter who came, no matter what happened next, he wouldn't leave her behind. Marcus stayed in the shelter, his eyes scanning the entrance. His hand still hovered over his weapon, but he knew it wasn't the time for confrontation. The footsteps from outside faded, and the silence that followed was both a relief and a warning. They weren't leaving, and they weren't exactly friendly. Aria remained unconscious, her chest rising and falling steadily. Marcus checked her wounds again, making sure the makeshift bandages were still in place. He couldn't afford to let her condition worsen. She had to survive, but he was beginning to realize that it wasn't just her life on the line. He settled down next to her, his mind racing with questions. Who had been searching for them? Was it a rescue mission, or something more dangerous? The voice had sounded neutral, almost too calm. Marcus couldn't tell if the strangers outside were here to help, or if they had their own motives. Minutes passed, though it felt like hours. Marcus tried to focus, watching for any signs of movement outside. The dust continued to swirl in the air, carried by the faint breeze that found its way into the shelter. The light from the twin moons cast long shadows against the walls, adding to the eerie feeling of isolation. Just as Marcus began to lose hope, he heard the sound of footsteps approaching again. But this time, they weren't alone. There was a soft clinking of metal and low voices, speaking in a language he didn't understand. He stiffened, ready to spring into action if he had to. But he didn't want to fight if it wasn't necessary. His priority was Aria's safety. The footsteps halted just outside the entrance. A low voice spoke again, but this time it wasn't directed at him. It was directed at someone else. Is she alive? The voice asked, full of concern. Marcus's heart skipped a beat. They're talking about Aria. He stood, keeping his movements slow and steady to avoid drawing attention. He glanced at her one last time before stepping cautiously toward the entrance. Peering out, he saw two figures standing in the dim light. They were both humanoid, but their features were different from his. One had dark green skin, while the other had silver markings running across their face. They were dressed in simple, rugged clothing, suggesting they weren't part of any formal military unit. Neither seemed to notice him as they huddled over Aria. The taller of the two knelt beside her, his eyes scanning her injuries. He reached into a small pouch on his belt and pulled out a vial of bright blue liquid, uncorking it carefully. What happened to her? The second figure asked, her voice filled with an urgency that Marcus hadn't expected. She was shorter and wore her hair tied back in a loose braid. She was attacked, Marcus answered, stepping into the dim light. I found her out there, barely alive. I don't know who did this, but I couldn't leave her behind. Both figures turned toward him, their expressions unreadable. For a moment, the world seemed to hold its breath. The tall one, who had green skin, sized Marcus up with a careful, calculating look before speaking again. You're human, he said, as if stating a fact, and you've come to help her. Marcus nodded, his hand still hovering near his weapon, but not reaching for it. I didn't come here to make enemies. I'm just trying to get her the help she needs. The smaller figure, the woman, glanced at the green-skinned man. She seemed to hesitate for a moment before walking closer to Marcus. What's your name, human? She asked. Marcus Hale, he replied simply, still unsure if he could trust these strangers. "And you are?" "I'm Zora," she said, nodding toward the green-skinned man. "This is Cal." Cal gave Marcus a brief nod, his gaze flicking to Area. "We're not here to harm you. We've been tracking the ships that come through this sector. We know who's been causing trouble, and it's not you." Marcus relaxed slightly. He had learned to trust his instincts, and they were telling him that these two weren't the enemies he feared. But that didn't mean he could trust them completely. Not yet. "I didn't come here to get caught up in any war," Marcus said. "I'm just here to help her." Zora knelt beside Area, her hands moving quickly as she checked the wound. "She's not from around here," she murmured, her brow furrowed. "She's from a different planet." "Do you know who did this to her?" Marcus asked, his voice rough. Zora looked up, her face hardening. "There's a faction that's been hunting down people like her. They're not from this planet. They've been raiding colonies, taking captives, and leaving no survivors." Cal's voice was calm, but there was an edge to it. "We've been tracking them for a while. They've caused enough damage, and they're getting bolder. We can't let them do this to more people." Marcus's blood ran cold. He hadn't expected this. He hadn't even known there were factions out there willing to cause such destruction. But if what Zara and Cal were saying was true, this was bigger than anything he had imagined. Area stirred, her eyes flickering open again. Marcus rushed to her side, his hand on her shoulder, trying to comfort her despite the chaos around them. "Area," he whispered, his voice gentle. "You're safe. We'll help you." Her eyes met his, and for the briefest moment, there was recognition in her gaze. Then her body relaxed, and she sank back into unconsciousness. But this time, she seemed more peaceful. Zara stood, turning to Marcus. "We can help her, but we need to move quickly. There's no telling how much longer we have before the raiders come looking for her." Marcus nodded. He didn't have to think twice. The choice was clear. He would fight to protect Area, and whoever else needed help. It was no longer just about a rescue mission. It was about stopping a threat bigger than anything he had ever faced. And he wasn't going to back down. Not now. Not ever. The shelter was small, but it was their only cover. The sound of the wind howling outside reminded Marcus just how vulnerable they were. With Area still unconscious and the threat of the raiders looming, he couldn't afford to sit back and wait. Time was running out. Zara and Cal had been clear. They couldn't stay here for much longer. The raiders would come looking for Area, and they would bring a small army. Marcus had seen their type before, merciless, ruthless, and willing to do anything to get what they wanted. "We need to move," Cal said, his voice low and serious. "The longer we stay, the more likely they'll find us. There's a transport hidden a few clicks away. It's our only chance." Marcus turned to Area, her fragile form lying still on the ground. She had been through so much already. He couldn't let them take her. Not now. Not ever. He looked at Zara and Cal, seeing the same determination in their eyes. They weren't just strangers anymore. They were allies, even if only for a short time. "How far is the transport?" Marcus asked, his voice steady, despite the growing tension in his chest. "Not far," Zara answered. "It's hidden in the hills, away from the main routes, but we need to move quickly. The raiders will start their search soon, and they won't stop until they find what they're looking for." Marcus nodded. "Let's go then." Zara and Cal quickly packed what little they had, gathering supplies from their small packs. Cal checked his weapon and adjusted his armor, while Zara helped Marcus lift Area onto a makeshift stretcher they had fashioned from some nearby branches and fabric. Area was still too weak to walk, and Marcus knew they couldn't afford to waste time. Every second counted. They moved quickly through the rocky landscape, staying low to the ground to avoid being seen. The hills ahead offered some cover, but they weren't far enough away to feel safe. Marcus kept glancing over his shoulder, his eyes scanning the horizon for any signs of danger. He couldn't let his guard down, not when Area's life and perhaps their own, depended on it. As they trekked through the rough terrain, Marcus couldn't help but wonder about Zara and Kale. They didn't seem like ordinary travelers. There was something about them, something in the way they moved and spoke, that made him think they had been through more battles than he could count. And yet, they didn't seem to be in a rush. Their calm demeanor made Marcus both nervous and grateful. They were professionals, and he needed that right now. "How did you two end up here?" Marcus asked, trying to make conversation. "You said you were tracking the raiders. What's your story?" Zara glanced at him as they walked, a small smile tugging at the corner of her lips. "We've been fighting these raiders for years," she said. "They've been causing trouble across several systems, raiding colonies, taking prisoners, and leaving destruction in their wake. We've been working to stop them, one mission at a time." Kale spoke next, his voice low and serious. "It's not just about stopping them. It's about finding out who's behind it all. There's a larger group out there pulling the strings. The raiders are just pawns." Marcus frowned, taking in what Kale said. A larger group. He couldn't imagine what kind of force would be powerful enough to control something as dangerous as these raiders. It sounded like a galactic-scale problem, something far beyond the scope of a simple rescue mission. "Yes," Zara replied. "And they won't stop until they have complete control over every system they can reach. They're using the raiders to weaken the defenses of the colonies, to make it easier for their real forces to take over." Marcus absorbed this new information, his mind racing. This wasn't just a fight for survival. It was a battle for the future of every colony in the galaxy. If these people were really behind the raiders, it meant that Iria's life was tied to something much larger than any of them had imagined. "We can't let them win," Marcus said, his voice tight with determination. "We can't let them hurt any more people." Zara and Kale exchanged a glance, their eyes meeting in silent agreement. "We'll stop them," Kale said firmly. "We'll make sure they never reach another colony. But first, we need to get out of here." They continued to move through the rocky hills, each step taking them closer to the hidden transport. The wind had picked up again, the dust swirling in the air and making it harder to see. The rugged landscape offered some cover, but Marcus knew that the raiders could be just as familiar with this terrain as they were. When they finally reached the transport, Marcus breathed a sigh of relief. The vehicle was a small, sleek craft, nothing too flashy, but practical. It looked like it had been hidden away for a long time, covered in dust and debris. Zara approached the craft and began working on the control panel. "Stay alert," she warned. "We don't know how long we have." Marcus nodded, his eyes scanning the area once more. He didn't know who was coming for them or when, but he did know one thing for certain. He wasn't going to let anyone take Area from him. Not after everything they had been through together. Kale moved to the side, keeping watch, while Zara continued to work. The seconds stretched on, each one feeling like an eternity. Finally, with a soft beep, the transport systems came online. "We're good to go," Zara said, her voice relieved but still cautious. "Let's move." They helped Area into the transport, and Marcus followed closely behind, his heart still pounding in his chest. They were one step closer to safety, but he knew the hardest part was still ahead. The transport hummed to life, its engines growling softly as it lifted off the ground. The narrow hills that had hidden them for a brief moment now seemed like a distant memory, and the open sky stretched endlessly before them. But Marcus knew better than to relax. The raiders would be on their trail soon. They didn't leave things unfinished. Zara worked quickly at the control panel, her fingers moving over the buttons with practiced ease. Kale sat in the co-pilot's seat, scanning the horizon for any signs of movement. Marcus sat in the back with Area, watching her as she slowly began to stir. The alien girl's face was pale, but her eyes fluttered open, her gaze still distant and confused. The sight of her awake brought a tiny bit of relief to Marcus, but it didn't last long. "Are we safe?" Area whispered, her voice weak. Her hand reached out, grabbing Marcus's arm as though she feared something or someone might reach out for her. Marcus met her eyes, giving her the most reassuring smile he could manage. "We're moving, Aria. We're going to be okay. We just need to get to safety." Aria nodded, though doubt clouded her features. She didn't fully believe him, and Marcus couldn't blame her. She had seen too much suffering, too much betrayal. But they were getting out of this. He wouldn't let her down. Zara glanced back, her eyes flicking to the rear view screen. "We're not out of the woods yet," she muttered. "Stay sharp." Marcus's heart skipped a beat as he followed her gaze. In the distance, tiny specks were moving. Fast. Too fast. "Looks like we've been spotted," Cale said, his tone grim. "We'll have company soon." The transport surged forward, accelerating as Zara took the controls. The craft groaned as it pushed through the thickening air, leaving the ground far behind. The wind howled outside, battering against the metal hull, but inside, all Marcus could hear was the loud hum of the engine and the steady beat of his own heart. "We're in for a fight," Cale said, turning his attention to the rear of the craft. "Stay ready." Zora's eyes were hard, focused entirely on the controls. "We'll outrun them for now, but they won't stop chasing. We need to get to the cloud cover and lose them." Marcus nodded, understanding the plan. If they could lose the raiders in the dense clouds, they might have a chance. The transport was fast, but not fast enough to outrun a determined group of raiders. Not on an open path. Behind them, the specks grew larger. The raiders had their sights locked onto them, and they were closing in quickly. Marcus couldn't help but feel the weight of the situation. He had never imagined his life would lead him here, running for his life with an alien girl who had been hunted for reasons he didn't fully understand. But he would do whatever it took to keep her safe. "Hold on," Zora shouted, pulling the transport hard to the right. The craft jolted, throwing everyone against their seats as it veered sharply. The sudden shift of direction sent the raiders off course for a brief moment, but Marcus could see them adjusting, realigning for another pass. "They'll keep coming," Cale muttered. "They're not going to stop until they have her. We need a new plan." Marcus thought quickly, his mind racing. The raiders had weapons, but so did they. Zara was an expert pilot, and Cale knew combat like the back of his hand. But the odds weren't in their favor. "We don't fight them head-on," Marcus said, his voice steady despite the rising tension. "We need to outsmart them, not outgun them." Zara glanced back for a brief moment, her eyes narrowing. "What do you have in mind?" "If we can get high enough and move through the clouds, we can lose them in the cover. After that, we can turn the tables. If they can't see us, they can't target us." Cale nodded. "I'll be ready for a fight if it comes to that. But if you can lose them in the clouds, that's our best shot." Zara took a deep breath, adjusting her grip on the controls. The transport bucked and jolted as she pushed it harder, faster. The clouds ahead grew thicker, and Marcus felt a flicker of hope. They might just pull this off. Behind them, the raiders followed closely, relentless in their pursuit. The air was thick with tension as the distance between them and their pursuers closed. It felt like an eternity before they reached the clouds. But once they did, the whole world changed. The dense clouds enveloped the transport, wrapping it in a thick, misty blanket. The raiders, unable to see through the clouds, slowed their pursuit, trying to get a fix on the transport's position. "We lost them," Zara said, her voice slightly relieved but still cautious. "For now." Marcus exhaled sharply, the tension in his chest easing. But he knew this wasn't over. The raiders would be back, and they'd be angrier than ever. They couldn't afford to slow down. "We've got a small window," Cale said, eyes scanning the clouded skies. "We need to find a way to lay low for a while. The more time we spend out here, the more likely we are to get caught." "We'll find a place to land," Zara replied. "Something off the grid. It'll buy us some time." The transport continued to cut through the clouds, moving silently above the planet below. They weren't out of danger yet, But they had gained some breathing room, and with every second that passed, Marcus felt a bit more hopeful. They could do this. They just had to keep moving. The transport was silent now, its engines only a soft hum as it floated through the dense clouds. Marcus sat next to Aria, who had finally rested, though her eyes remained distant. She wasn't fully recovered, but at least her condition had stabilized for now. Every time he glanced at her, he was reminded of how close they had come to losing her. He didn't know her well yet, but he knew that he couldn't let anything happen to her. Not after all she had been through. Zara and Kel were up front, their eyes focused on the redouts and the shifting scenery below. The clouds had thickened even more, and the sky was a dark gray, threatening rain, but they were far from safe. The raiders would be looking for them, scouring every inch of the skies for their target. "We need to land soon," Zara said, breaking the silence. "We can't stay up here forever." "I know," Kel responded. "We need a place where we can hide and regroup. Somewhere off the radar." As he turned back to the group, he caught Aria's gaze. For the first time, he saw something more than just fear in her eyes. There was a flicker of hope, the kind that comes when someone believes they've been given a second chance. And that was exactly what he intended to give her. The days that followed in the abandoned facility were quiet, but the weight of uncertainty still hung over the group. Marcus had become accustomed to the cold, and despite the danger, there was a strange sense of calm in the air. Aria was healing, her strength returning with each passing day. But Marcus knew the peace wouldn't last long. They couldn't stay here forever. Zara and Kel were doing everything they could to keep an eye on the surrounding area, checking for any signs of the raiders. But the place was isolated, and the raiders hadn't found them yet. It seemed like the perfect hiding spot, but Marcus couldn't help but feel they were running out of time. He had grown close to Aria over the past few days. The initial fear in her eyes had softened, replaced by a quiet determination. She was no longer just a stranger he'd saved. She was someone who had been through unimaginable pain, and he had promised to protect her. In return, she had given him her trust, a gift he knew he couldn't take lightly. One afternoon, after Marcus had finished checking the perimeter with Kel, he found Aria sitting alone, her gaze distant as she stared at the snowy landscape outside. The fire crackled in the background, casting warm light across the room, but her expression remained unchanged. "Are you okay?" Marcus asked, sitting down beside her. Aria nodded slowly but didn't speak at first. Her eyes were dark, the weight of her past still evident in the quiet moments when her guard was down. But there was something else there too, a flicker of hope that hadn't been there before. "I never thought I'd be free again," she said quietly, her voice barely above a whisper. "For so long, I thought I was lost, that there was no way out of the nightmare. But then you saved me. And I don't know how to thank you for that." Marcus felt a knot tighten in his chest. He wasn't sure how to respond, but he knew that whatever words he chose, they wouldn't be enough to express the depth of his feelings. "You don't need to thank me," he said gently. "You didn't deserve any of this. But now you're free. And I'm here to make sure you stay that way." Aria's eyes met his, and for the first time, she smiled. A small, fragile smile, but one that made Marcus' heart feel lighter. In that moment, he knew that he wasn't just fighting for survival. He was fighting for something bigger, something worth protecting. Later that evening, after dinner had been prepared, Zara gathered the group around the small fire in the center of the room. "We've been hiding for days," Zara said, her voice steady. "But we can't run forever. The raiders will be back, and we need to be ready." Kel nodded in agreement. "We've had some time to rest, but it's time to move forward. We need to find a way to get off this planet, and I think we've got a shot at doing it." Marcus looked between them, his mind racing. He knew they were right. Hiding wasn't a permanent solution. But the thought of leaving Aria behind, of leaving her in a world that had once nearly destroyed her, was something he couldn't bear. "We'll find a way," Marcus said firmly. "But I won't leave her. Not after everything she's been through." Zora looked at him, her eyes narrowing. She understood. She knew that the bond between Marcus and Aria had grown deeper than just survival. "We're in this together," she said. "We'll figure something out. But we need a plan. We can't just keep hiding." The group sat in silence for a moment, each one lost in their thoughts. The future was uncertain, but one thing was clear. Whatever came next, they would face it together. The strength of their bond would be their guiding force. As the fire crackled and the night settled around them, Marcus turned his attention to Aria. She was sitting on the other side of the room now, her hands folded in her lap. He could see the quiet determination in her eyes, the same look he had seen in himself countless times during his own struggles. She was strong, stronger than he could have ever imagined. "We'll head for the mountain range," Zara said, her voice steady but tense. "There's an old mining facility there. It's abandoned, off the grid. We can lay low until the raiders lose interest." Marcus nodded, but a sense of unease lingered. Every move they made felt like they were walking on a tightrope. One wrong step, and everything could come crashing down. As they descended toward the mountains, the mist parted, revealing jagged peaks and deep valleys. The area looked desolate, untouched by civilization for decades. It was the perfect place to hide, but Marcus couldn't shake the feeling that they were being watched. "Almost there," Zara said, her grip tightening on the controls. The transport swayed as it navigated through the narrow valleys. "Stay alert. If anyone's tracking us, they'll be able to see the craft from a distance." The facility Zara spoke of appeared in the distance, a rundown metal structure clinging to the side of a mountain. It looked abandoned, its once pristine exterior now corroded by time and neglect. But it would work. It had to. As they approached the landing zone, the transport dipped and veered, the air growing colder as they neared the ground. The facility's long-forgotten landing pad was barely visible, hidden under a thick layer of snow and ice. Zara expertly guided the craft down, the landing gear scraping against the frozen surface before it finally came to a stop. The engine's hum faded, and an eerie silence settled over the area. Marcus could hear his heartbeat in his ears as he stepped out of the transport, his boots crunching against the snow. The air was frigid, and his breath came out in puffs of white mist. Cale was already moving toward the entrance of the facility, his eyes scanning the surroundings for any signs of movement. Zara followed closely behind, her face set with determination. "Stay close," Cale ordered as they made their way toward the building. "We don't know what we're walking into." The entrance was rusted, the doors hanging half open as if abandoned long ago. It looked like it hadn't been used in years. Zara pushed the doors open with ease, the sound of metal scraping against metal echoing through the empty halls. Inside, the facility was dark and cold. The walls were lined with old machinery, the dust and cobwebs telling the story of years of neglect. It was a ghost town, a place that had once been busy with work, but was now just a forgotten relic of the past. "Let's find a safe spot," Zara said, her voice low. "We'll set up a temporary camp here, at least for the night." As they moved deeper into the facility, Marcus couldn't shake the feeling that something wasn't right. The air felt still, as though the building itself was holding its breath. Every creak and groan of the old structure seemed amplified in the silence. Aria, still weak from her injuries, clung to Marcus's side. Her steps were slow, but she was moving under her own strength now. It was a good sign. She had come a long way since they had first met, and he could see the spark of life returning to her eyes, despite everything that had happened. They found a small room near the back of the facility that seemed relatively secure. There were old crates and storage boxes that they could use to barricade the door, at least for the time being. Zara immediately began to work on setting up a small heat source, while Kel checked the perimeter. Marcus helped Aria sit down on an old crate, making sure she was comfortable. He could see the fear still lingering in her eyes, but she was trying to hide it. She was strong, stronger than anyone he knew. But even the strongest people had their breaking points. He could only imagine how much she had been through. "You're safe here," Marcus said gently, taking the seat beside her. "We'll keep watch. No one's going to hurt you." Arya nodded, her eyes closing as she leaned back against the wall. It was clear she was exhausted, and Marcus didn't blame her. The past few days had been a whirlwind of chaos and uncertainty, but now they had a chance to breathe. Zara and Kale finished securing the room, and the group settled in for the night. The fire Zora had started crackled softly, casting a warm glow on their faces. The heat was a welcome relief from the biting cold outside, but Marcus knew it wouldn't last long. The raiders wouldn't stop, not until they had what they came for. He looked out the small window, staring at the dark sky beyond. The stars were hidden behind the thick clouds, but he knew that beyond those clouds was the hope they needed to survive. They had a chance now. They were safe, at least for a moment. And that was all they could ask for. As he turned back to the group, he caught Arya's gaze. For the first time, he saw something more than just fear in her eyes. There was a flicker of hope, the kind that comes when someone believes they've been given a second chance. And that was exactly what he intended to give her. The days that followed in the abandoned facility were quiet, but the weight of uncertainty still hung over the group. Marcus had become accustomed to the cold, and despite the danger, there was a strange sense of calm in the air. Arya was healing, her strength returning with each passing day. But Marcus knew the peace wouldn't last long. They couldn't stay here forever. Zara and Kale were doing everything they could to keep an eye on the surrounding area, checking for any signs of the raiders. But the place was isolated, and the raiders hadn't found them yet. It seemed like the perfect hiding spot, but Marcus couldn't help but feel they were running out of time. He had grown close to Arya over the past few days. The initial fear in her eyes had softened, replaced by a quiet determination. She was no longer just a stranger he'd saved. She was someone who had been through unimaginable pain, and he had promised to protect her. In return, she had given him her trust, a gift he knew he couldn't take lightly. One afternoon, after Marcus had finished checking the perimeter with Kel, he found Arya sitting alone, her gaze distant as she stared at the snowy landscape outside. The fire crackled in the background, casting warm light across the room, but her expression remained unchanged. "Are you okay?" Marcus asked, sitting down beside her. Arya nodded slowly but didn't speak at first. Her eyes were dark, the weight of her past still evident in the quiet moments when her guard was down. But there was something else there too, a flicker of hope that hadn't been there before. "I never thought I'd be free again," she said quietly, her voice barely above a whisper. "For so long, I thought I was lost, that there was no way out of the nightmare. But then you saved me, and I don't know how to thank you for that." Marcus felt a knot tighten in his chest. He wasn't sure how to respond, but he knew that whatever words he chose, they wouldn't be enough to express the depth of his feelings. "You don't need to thank me," he said gently. "You didn't deserve any of this, but now you're free, and I'm here to make sure you stay that way." Arya's eyes met his, and for the first time, she smiled. A small, fragile smile, but one that made Marcus' heart feel lighter. In that moment, he knew that he wasn't just fighting for survival. He was fighting for something bigger, something worth protecting. Later that evening, after dinner had been prepared, Zara gathered the group around the small fire in the center of the room. "We've been hiding for days," Zara said, her voice steady. "But we can't run forever. The raiders will be back, and we need to be ready." Kale nodded in agreement. "We've had some time to rest, but it's time to move forward. We need to find a way to get off this planet, and I think we've got a shot at doing it." Marcus looked between them, his mind racing. He knew they were right. Hiding wasn't a permanent solution, but the thought of leaving Arya behind, of leaving her in a world that had once nearly destroyed her, was something he couldn't bear. "We'll find a way," Marcus said firmly, "but I won't leave her. Not after everything she's been through." Zora looked at him, her eyes narrowing. She understood. She knew that the bond between Marcus and Aria had grown deeper than just survival. "We're in this together," she said. "We'll figure something out. But we need a plan. We can't just keep hiding." The group sat in silence for a moment, each one lost in their thoughts. The future was uncertain, but one thing was clear. Whatever came next, they would face it together. The strength of their bond would be their guiding force. As the fire crackled and the night settled around them, Marcus turned his attention to Aria. She was sitting on the other side of the room now, her hands folded in her lap. He could see the quiet determination in her eyes, the same look he had seen in himself countless times during his own struggles. She was strong, stronger than he could have ever imagined. "I know you're scared," Marcus said, his voice low but firm. "But you don't have to face this alone. We're all in this together. We'll get through it, no matter what." Aria turned to him, her eyes filled with gratitude and something more, a quiet understanding that only the two of them shared. She had been lost, but now she was found. And whatever the future held, they would face it side by side. The next morning, the team set their plan into motion. They would leave the abandoned facility, head toward the nearest city, and find a way to escape the planet. It wouldn't be easy, but they were no longer just survivors. They were a team, bound by trust, strength, and the shared goal of freedom. As they gathered their things and prepared to leave, Marcus took one last look at the facility, knowing that it had been more than just a hiding place. It had been a symbol of hope, a place where they had come together and forged a future. And with that, they left the shadows behind. There was a whole galaxy waiting for them, and they were ready to face it head-on, together.